In the autumn of 1963, Ryoichi Kawai sat in a Tokyo boardroom and listened to his own government read his company its death sentence. The Ministry of Trade had just cleared the American giant Caterpillar to build inside Japan. The last market, Komatsu, still held. Kawai did not argue. He walked out and gave a secret order with a strange name: Maru-C Encircle Caterpillar. 3 decades later, that order would build the largest bulldozer that has ever existed, made for one purpose: to destroy Caterpillar. This is the story of that machine and the war that built it. That machine was the last shot in a war that had already lasted 30 years. And that war was born out of pure humiliation. For most of its history, Komatsu was a national embarrassment, a company that could not build a single machine the world would trust. Komatsu was born in 1921 in a snow country town on the west coast of Japan, spun out of a mining firm that needed tools and could not buy good ones from abroad. For its first years, it made pumps and small tractors, and it made them badly. When the company finally built its first crawler tractor in 1931, it was a copy through and through. Engineers had taken an American Caterpillar tractor apart, measured every piece, and rebuilt it in Japanese steel. And Japanese steel in those years was the problem. The copies cracked. They overheated. They broke down in the field and had to be dragged home behind the machines meant to replace them. For a proud company in a proud country, this was a wound that would not close. Every tractor they shipped was a reminder that the Americans did it better. Then the war came, and it made everything worse. Komatsu turned its factories over to the military and built tank parts and artillery while, across the Pacific, Caterpillar machines were landing on every beach the Allies took, carving airfields out of jungle and clearing rubble out of ruined cities. When the fighting stopped, American bombers had flattened much of Japanese industry, and the occupation government banned the Japanese from building heavy equipment at all. Caterpillar came out of the war as the most trusted name in earth moving on the planet. Komatsu came out of it with wrecked factories, a banned product line, and a reputation for junk. The dream behind the company had been a patriotic one: to free Japan from waiting on imported machines that arrived late, cost a fortune, and broke the moment they hit hard rock. For decades, the results fell painfully short of it. The early tractors were reverse-engineered from whatever foreign machine the company could get its hands on, and the men who built them knew they were turning out copies of another country's work. When one of those machines broke down on a job site, and they broke down often, there was no quiet way to hide it. The machine simply sat there in the open, dead, with the company name stamped on its side for everyone to see. In a country where a company's name was everything it had, that kind of public failure carried a weight that is hard to describe now. The war years hollowed the company out. Skilled workers went to the front, the good steel went to the military, and what came back after the surrender was a set of damaged factories with almost nothing worth selling. When the occupation finally let the Japanese build heavy machines again, Komatsu had to start almost from nothing, in a country still clearing its own rubble. And the machines that country trusted to rebuild itself still came, stamped with an American name. Every dozer a Japanese contractor actually trusted was a foreign one. For the men at Komatsu, rebuilding their own nation with another country's machines was a daily reminder of how far behind they still were. That reputation is the thing you have to feel to understand what came next. Into the 1950s, contractors across Asia lived by a simple rule: if the job mattered, you bought American. Komatsu machines were the cheap option, the ones you settled for, the ones that let you down when the work got hard. A review of the era found that Japanese bulldozers needed major repairs after only a fraction of the hours an American machine would run before it so much as coughed. Everyone in the industry knew it. Worst of all, The men inside Komatsu knew it too, and they had to live with it every single day. If you want to understand how a company claws its way up from making broken copies of another man's work, take a second right now and subscribe, because that climb, from national embarrassment all the way to the machine that scared Caterpillar half to death, is exactly what we are about to walk through, one hard step at a time. The fight to end that humiliation began a full generation before the son ever took command, under his father, the elder Kawai. Under him, in 1961, Komatsu did something that sounds small and was not. It adopted a quality discipline drawn from the same ideas then rebuilding Toyota, a system the Japanese called total quality control. Every worker, from the man on the line to the engineer at the drafting table, was pulled into small groups whose only job was to hunt defects and kill them, one by one, forever. It was slow, it was unglamorous, and it was the only weapon a company with weak steel and no reputation actually had in its hands. Then, in 1963, the government dropped its bomb, and the son inherited the fight. The ministry had decided to let Caterpillar form a partnership with Mitsubishi and manufacture inside Japan itself. To the men running Komatsu, it felt like their own government had just signed them over to the enemy. The American giant would now build behind the very wall that had protected the home market, and the analysts of Tokyo said it plainly. 3 years, they predicted, and the puny local company would be finished for good. Kawai took the presidency in 1964 and refused to accept the sentence. He launched a campaign inside the company with a single, nearly impossible target: raise the quality of Komatsu's core Bulldozer to the level of Caterpillar's within 3 years, or there was no reason to keep going at all. To make certain that no one could hide from the truth, his engineers did something painful. They bought Caterpillar machines, tore them down to the last bolt, and laid the American parts out on the floor beside their own. The comparison was brutal and honest. The American components were simply built to last longer, and there was nothing anyone in the room could say to make that go away. There were no more excuses on the table. There was only the gap, measured in steel, staring back at them. What followed was one of the fastest quality turnarounds in the history of industry. Warranty claims fell year after year as the quality groups redesigned the frames to spread the stresses their weaker steel could not carry, and hardened the parts that failed first. In 1964, Komatsu won the Deming Prize, the highest honor for quality in Japan. Within a few years, its new bulldozers were finally matching Caterpillar's own benchmarks for durability, and they were doing it at a lower price. Dealers began to notice something they had never seen in their lives. Contractors who bought Komatsu were no longer settling for less. They were getting equal iron for real money less, and they were beginning to prefer it. And here is where the story turns from survival into ambition, because Kawai was not finished when he caught up. Catching up had never been the plan. The plan was the strange order from that boardroom in 1963, and now, at last, the company was strong enough to carry it out. Maru-C. Encircle Caterpillar. The name was taken from an ancient board game called Go, and the choice of that game tells you exactly how Komatsu intended to fight. Go is not a game of brute force. A skilled player wins through patience, quietly surrounding the opponent, claiming the edges of the board and closing off his room to breathe, until one day the opponent looks up and finds he has nowhere left to move. Kawai looked at Caterpillar, a company with a century of history and factories on every continent, and he understood that he could never beat that head-on. So he set out to surround it instead. The encirclement ran market by market, and it turned Caterpillar's own strengths into weaknesses. Caterpillar had grown slow and complex, and Komatsu made speed and price its whole game. In the 1970s, When oil money set off a construction boom across the Middle East, and contractors needed machines the moment they could get them, Caterpillar's own complexity turned against it. Its order backlog could stretch beyond a year. Komatsu, running lean and hungry, delivered comparable machines in a fraction of that time, and it delivered them cheaper. One government ministry in the Gulf placed a single order for hundreds of Komatsu dozers, the largest deal the company had ever signed. Komatsu was also willing to try things the Americans dismissed, weaving early electronic controls into its machines to adjust a blade with a precision Caterpillar could not yet match. Piece by piece, country by country, the underdog took the edges of the board, while the giant looked the other way. By the middle of the 1980s, Komatsu did the one thing a copycat was never supposed to dare. It came to America directly. It opened its own manufacturing plant on American soil in Chattanooga, Tennessee, so it could build machines inside the United States, get around the shifting winds of trade politics, and sell to American contractors as something close to a domestic supplier. The company that had started by taking an American machine apart on a workshop floor was now bolting its own machines together, a short drive from Caterpillar's customers. The edges of the board were no longer somewhere overseas. They were in Caterpillar's own backyard. For years, Caterpillar barely seemed to notice it was happening. Its executives had spent decades waving the Japanese company off as a copycat, a maker of knockoffs that would never truly matter. That contempt was about to become the most expensive mistake the company ever made. By then, Komatsu's sales had climbed to nearly 2/5 of Caterpillar's worldwide, and on Caterpillar's own home ground in the United States, the Japanese were winning real market share for the first time in the history of the rivalry. If you are following how a company nobody respected surrounded the biggest name in the entire industry, do this channel a real favor and hit subscribe, because we are about to reach the moment the strategy worked, the moment the American giant opened its own books and saw a number it had not seen in half a century. That moment arrived in the early 1980s, and it very nearly finished Caterpillar for good. Several disasters struck at once, and together they became a storm the company simply was not built to survive. The first disaster was money itself. The American dollar had grown enormously strong against the Japanese yen, which meant that every Komatsu machine suddenly cost far less on the world market than an equal Caterpillar, and Komatsu had not touched a single price to make it happen. The encirclement that Kawai had spent 20 years building was now armed by the currency markets themselves. Komatsu could undercut Caterpillar almost everywhere on Earth, and it did. The second disaster came from inside Caterpillar's own gates. In 1982, the union that built its machines walked out, and the strike did not last days or weeks. It lasted 206 days, the longest walkout in that union's history, and it froze production at the worst possible moment, exactly when the company needed to fight for every last sale. The third disaster came out of Washington. Caterpillar had won a large contract to supply machines for a Soviet natural gas pipeline, and when the American government imposed sanctions on the Soviet Union, that contract, worth around $90 million, was killed by Caterpillar's own government. Add all of it together, and the numbers turned catastrophic. In 1982, Caterpillar reported a loss for the full year, its first annual loss in roughly half a century. Across the 3 brutal years that followed, its losses ran to something on the order of $1 billion. There is a line people still repeat about this stretch, that Caterpillar was bleeding $1 million a day. That phrase is more legend than ledger, but the truth beneath it is just as stark. A company that had ruled its industry since before the Great Depression was now, in the words of its own executives, watching its very survival come into question. The copycat from the snow country had dragged the giant all the way to the edge of the grave. Caterpillar survived, but only because it finally took the threat seriously. Under a new chief executive named George Schaefer, the company did the things it had refused to do for decades. It cut costs down to the bone. It began moving some of its manufacturing outside the United States. It stopped believing its name alone could carry it through anything. And when the finance ministers of the largest economies met and agreed to drive the overvalued dollar back down, the currency edge that had armed Komatsu began to melt away, and Caterpillar could finally raise its prices and breathe again. Schaefer had pulled the company back from the cliff, but the balance of fear had shifted for good. Caterpillar would never again treat Komatsu as a joke. And this is the exact moment, with the giant wounded and the underdog stronger than it had ever been, that Komatsu chose to do something that had almost nothing to do with balance sheets and everything to do with pride. It decided to build a monument. It decided to build the largest bulldozer the world had ever seen or would ever see again. The machine was called the D575, and to understand why it was ever built, you have to accept that it was never really about profit. It was about making a statement in steel that no spec sheet could argue with. Komatsu had spent 20 years proving it could match Caterpillar part for part. Now it wanted to physically tower over the American giant on the open ground of a mine. The first version of the idea rolled onto the floor of a giant equipment show in Houston at the start of the 1980s, a prototype that produced 1,000 horsepower at a time when breaking 4 digits in a bulldozer was like breaking the sound barrier. It stood taller than Caterpillar's flagship, and in mining, where sheer size does the talking, that towering silhouette was the entire message. But then the global economy fell apart. The mining market evaporated overnight, and the giant prototype was rolled into a warehouse to gather dust. To the outside world, it looked like a failed experiment. Inside Komatsu, the order to encircle Caterpillar was still burning, and a small team spent the dead years quietly redrawing the machine, treating it no longer like a tractor, but like a weapon waiting for its war. When the markets finally recovered, Caterpillar had rolled out a new flagship of its own, so Komatsu tore the heart out of its giant and started over. The engineers ripped out the original engine and dropped in something far larger, a 12-cylinder diesel displacing 46 liters of raw capacity. When the machine finally broke cover in 1991, it was no longer a prototype. It was the D575, and it eventually climbed to 1,150 horsepower. It weighed more than 150 tons. Its blade could carry 90 cubic yards of earth in a single push, a blade that stood nearly 12 feet tall and stretched 24 feet across, its steel face alone weighing as much as a fully loaded school bus. Under that blade sat a piece of engineering that separated the giant from every ordinary dozer. Komatsu gave it a dual tilt system, letting the operator work 2 hydraulic cylinders independently, so he could pitch the cutting edge forward to bite into hardpan, or tilt it back to cradle a rolling load, or drop a single corner to steer the machine with the blade itself without ever cutting power to the tracks. An engine that large threw off heat like a blast furnace, so the engineers ran the cooling fans on hydraulics instead of belts, which meant the fans could scream at full speed even while the engine idled, holding back the heat during the stop and start rhythm of a working mine. It was a machine designed with obsessive care, and it was a nightmare to build. If you have followed this all the way up to the largest bulldozer that has ever existed, take one more second and subscribe, because the story of the D575 only turns stranger from here, first in the way they had to build it, and then in where on earth they had to send it to work. The nightmare was simple. The D575 was too big for the factory that made it. You cannot roll a machine that size down a normal assembly line, so it was built standing still, sitting in a fixed bay, like a ship in dry dock, while teams of workers rotated around it for weeks. As the story is told among the men who loved these machines, the hulls were welded by hand by master craftsmen because the plates were simply too thick and too delicate for the robots. Cast steel joined to rolled steel over 2 inches thick, a job where one wrong move with the heat would crack the metal as it cooled. Komatsu itself never made a legend of it, and the plain truth is prosaic enough. This was a near-custom machine, built in single digits, that ate the factory's best people for weeks. And everyone built quietly, slowed the lines, making the smaller machines that actually paid the bills. Komatsu had built a king, but Japan did not have a throne large enough to hold it. There was only one kind of work on the entire planet with the scale to justify a machine this size, and it was happening in the mountains of West Virginia. The job was called mountaintop removal, and it was exactly what those words say. Coal companies were pushing whole peaks down into the valleys below to expose the coal seams buried underneath. The scale of it went far beyond digging. Crews were rearranging the geography of the state itself, and the D575 became the primary weapon in a war against the mountains. Getting one to the job was a military operation of its own. You cannot drive a machine of more than 150 tons up a mountain road. It had to be stripped down to its bare frame, the blade and the ripper, and the tracks and the cab all pulled off, then hauled up the switchbacks on a convoy of 6 to 8 trucks, and rebuilt with cranes over days of labor in the mud. The local dealer, a company called Rish Equipment, had to invent new procedures just to service the thing, because if a single cylinder blew out on the job, you did not simply swap it. You called in a crane, and the machine was so heavy that it ground its own tracks into dust, turning routine undercarriage work into a bill that ran into the millions. But once it was running, the numbers were staggering. The first Superdozer version went to work at a coal operation in Cabin Creek, West Virginia, in 1995, and where the previous fleet had moved around 375 cubic yards of earth an hour. The D575 moved 750. It doubled the output of everything that came before it. At the peak of the coal boom, 17 of these giants were running across the state at the same time, and they earned a title among the crews: King of Appalachia. American operators, fiercely loyal to their own domestic iron, had to tip their hard hats to a Japanese machine. Even the most stubborn among them could not argue with 1,100 horsepower. Running one took a rare kind of nerve. The blade stood so tall that the operator could not see the load he was pushing. He had to feel it through the seat of his pants, reading a wall of dirt he could not look over, using that dual tilt to cradle the load and ride the wave of earth ahead of him like a surfer on water, steering the whole machine by feel. There is a single photograph that explains the scale of this thing better than any number ever could. A full-size pickup truck parked inside the blade, looking like a toy in a giant's hand. When the first of these machines worked near Las Vegas, ripping up the hard desert caliche, the company had to post a guard on it, because tourists were driving out from the strip just to stand beside the largest bulldozer in the world. And then, having built the biggest and meanest machine in the dirt, Komatsu waited for Caterpillar to answer. The whole industry waited with it. Everyone assumed Peoria would drop a giant of its own, a bigger hammer, and take the title back. The answer never came. And the reason it never came is the most important lesson in this entire story. Caterpillar did the math, and the math said, do not build it. Its engineers looked at the D575 and did not see a threat they had to match. They saw a machine that almost nobody on Earth could afford to buy. For every single one of Komatsu's giants that sold, roughly 20 of the next size down rolled off the lot. So Caterpillar refused to chase the crown. Instead of adding mass, it fixed the geometry, redesigning the blade on its existing flagship so that it carried and rolled its load far more efficiently, which let a machine 40 tons lighter punch far above its weight. Then it added electronics that stopped the tracks from slipping and squeezed more work out of every pass. Caterpillar closed the gap with clever engineering and a far lighter, far more mobile machine. It let Komatsu have the title of world's largest dozer and kept for itself the far larger business of the machines that actually sold. There was another reason too, and it was pure logistics. The Komatsu giant was a prisoner of the mine. Once you built it and hauled it up the mountain in pieces, it stayed there. Caterpillar's lighter flagship could be floated to a new site without turning the move into a construction project of its own. Between geometry, mobility, and the market math, the American answer was to hand the Japanese their monument and keep the business. There is a comment a veteran left under a video about these two machines, and it cuts straight to the bone. Caterpillar, he wrote, was not haunted by the Komatsu giant at all. Caterpillar was simply smart enough to know that its own flagship was big enough and practical enough, and that is why that machine is still in production today, while the giant is not. He is right, and it may be the most telling part of this entire story. Komatsu built the monster to make a point. Caterpillar looked at the same math, decided the crown was not worth the wait, and simply walked away from it. There was, very briefly, a machine even larger than the D575, an Italian-built giant that weighed around 180 tons, assembled from mostly Caterpillar parts, and intended for a buyer in Libya. But trade embargoes trapped it before it could ever work, and it never moved a serious load of earth in its life. It never turned a wheel in anger, and it ended its days as a curiosity. The D575 kept its title as the largest working bulldozer ever made. It simply could not keep its throne forever. Pulling a story like this together, machine by machine, takes us weeks of digging. There is a link down in the description to buy me a coffee and support us. And you will want to stay for this last chapter, because it is the hardest one to tell. The part where the monument Komatsu built to its own pride slowly turned into a stone around its neck. The end of the D575 did not come from Caterpillar at all. It came from the world changing underneath it. The first problem was the one Komatsu had carried from the very start. The machine ran at a loss. It was a prestige project, a symbol of hope kept alive for what it said about the company. And prestige does not appear anywhere on a balance sheet. Then, in 2008, the global financial crisis crushed commodity prices. Mining budgets evaporated, and nobody wanted to tie up millions of dollars in a specialized giant, with a lead time measured in months. The orders simply stopped. Then the job itself disappeared. In 2011, environmental regulators used the Clean Water Act to veto a major mining permit in West Virginia, the first time such a veto had ever been used against a mine that had already been approved. It effectively ended the era of pushing whole mountaintops down into the valleys. And if you cannot push the mountain over the edge, the D575 loses its entire reason to exist, because the D575 was built for one motion, and that motion was pushing. The mine switched to picking material up and hauling it away, and for that work, they wanted hydraulic excavators, machines that could pick coal out of waste rock with the care of a scalpel, while the giant dozer sat idle. A sledgehammer at the exact moment the whole industry had gone looking for precision. The last blow came from the exhaust pipe. New emissions standards demanded that big diesels slash their pollution, and meeting them meant bolting a mass of new hardware onto an engine that already filled the machine's frame to bursting, filters, and catalytic systems, and recirculated exhaust, all of it throwing off still more heat with nowhere left to put it. There was no room and no sane way to justify the cost of redesigning the entire machine for something that now sold perhaps a single unit a year. In 2012, Komatsu quietly pulled the plug. Across the whole production run, from the first machine to the last, only around 53 of these giants were ever built. The special bays in the factory were cleared for machines that made money, and the largest bulldozer in history faded into memory. The saddest part is that Komatsu had already, in a way, walked away from the war that created it. Back in 1989, a new president named Tetsuya Katada looked at a company that had spent a generation obsessed with one American rival and told his people to stop. Stop concentrating simply on catching up with Caterpillar, he said. The company had grown stereotyped and bureaucratic. The spirit of enterprise and challenge, he told them, had been lost. The order to encircle Caterpillar, the order Kawai had given in a boardroom in 1963, had done its work and outlived its purpose. The drive that had once saved the company had by then quietly turned into something that was holding it back. So where do the monsters go when the war is finally over? Most of them went to the cutting torch, sliced into scrap the moment the contracts dried up. But a few survived, saved by enthusiasts who refused to see them as depreciation on a balance sheet and saw them instead as history cast in steel. One still sits for sale in South Carolina today, with around 26,000 hours on the clock and a price near $875,000. A working relic of a war most people never even knew was fought. It still runs, waiting for a mountain that no longer exists. A couple more ended up preserved as museum pieces, machines you can still walk up to and climb into. Time capsules of analog gauges and the raw ambition of a company that built the impossible just to prove it could. Here is where the honest accounting matters, because the internet loves to say that Komatsu beat Caterpillar, and it did not. At its absolute peak, Komatsu reached only around 2/5 of Caterpillar's size, and to this very day, it remains the number 2 name in the industry, still chasing the same giant it has chased from the beginning. Komatsu never won, but it did something that history should remember just as clearly. A company that came out of a lost war, making cracked copies in bad steel. A company its own government once tried to hand to the enemy, frightened the largest machine builder on the planet so badly that the giant very nearly died of the fear, and then built a monster so enormous that the whole world still measures every other machine against it. That is not the story of a company that won. It is the story of a company that refused to lose and made the giant bleed for every inch of ground it took. And there is one final chapter in this machine's strange afterlife. One more Komatsu that became a legend, though never for any reason its engineers intended. In the summer of 2004, in a small Colorado town, a man named Marvin Heemeyer climbed into a Komatsu bulldozer he had spent a year and a half secretly wrapping in concrete and steel, sealed himself inside with no way back out, and drove it straight through the town he believed had wronged him, flattening more than a dozen buildings before the machine finally ground to a halt. But that machine, and the man who turned it into a weapon, and the strange truth hiding behind the legend that grew up around him, is a story that deserves its own telling. And that is exactly where we are going next.